Hello and welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Unseen Histories. Hi, it's Violet here. In this episode, we're setting sail for an adventure on the high seas. In our connected, globalised world, the question of who governs the oceans is increasingly urgent. As mining capabilities develop, the seabed becomes more and more valuable, just at the moment when environmental concerns are at an all-time high. Meanwhile, our reliance on the seamless flow of shipping lanes was highlighted when the Ever Given lodged itself in the Suez Canal last year, blocking the major route between the Far East and the Mediterranean and causing widespread disruption. Things have changed dramatically in recent decades. Onboard refrigeration and trawl devices have made it feasible for fishing fleets to travel thousands of miles from their home ports, spending months at sea and depleting fish stocks to the point of extinction. In parts of the world, the sea has become an arena of political tension as countries attempt to increase their maritime status, laying claim to strategic islands, extending the area of coastal sea they control, and asserting their power over important trade routes. David Bosco discusses all these fascinating issues and many more besides in The Poseidon Project, the struggle to govern the world's oceans. In this episode, David takes us back to 1982, a fraught year on the high seas when Britain was battling Argentina in the South Atlantic for control of the Falkland Islands. David Bosco is an associate professor of international studies at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. I spoke to David the other day. Welcome to Travels Through Time, David Bosco.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
I know that you're joining us today from Indiana. And before we begin our conversation, which is going to be about your new book, The Poseidon Project, the struggle to govern the world's oceans, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your background and jobs that you've done in your life, because you've had a very, very interesting career. And if you could give us that background first, and then we'll launch into this book and why you've written it.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'd always known I was very interested in international relations. So that was what I studied in university, and and then actually I was over in the UK for a master's degree, kind of following up on those studies. But this was during the period of the war in Bosnia, and so right after I submitted my master's thesis, I headed over to Sarajevo to work in Bosnia. The war had just ended, so this was in the months after the peace agreement, and it was focused on refugee issues and trying to get people back to their homes after the war. But it was a fascinating experience and kind of introduction to international politics and international law in some ways, because you had the war crimes investigations going on, and you had a lot of different legal processes playing out in Bosnia. So it was a very interesting couple of years. And then I came back to the US to go to law school, and ended up working at a big international law firm for a couple of years, which it was a good experience, but I knew I didn't want to do it for too long, and then I transitioned to the journalism world, to Foreign Policy magazine, where I was an editor for a number of years, and then into academia. So it's been kind of a winding path.
And it must have been very interesting, as you say, you were studying and then you went to Bosnia. And how does that interplay between the theory that you're learning at university and then actually seeing on the ground how it works in practice?
Yeah, that was because I'd been very focused on it and had been reading as much as I could find about it, but then to actually go into the country And I remember, driving into Bosnia for the first time and, seeing the destruction and the effects of the war was very, it obviously hits you in a very different way, seeing it and then interacting with, some of the people who had suffered its effects. And, we did some projects with people who needed to be medically evacuated out of Bosnia. And so you got a real kind of firsthand sense of what the costs of the war had been. So it was, but at the same time, you had those big political processes that that I'd studied playing out, and so that part didn't go away, but it was just accompanied now by this kind of human dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to your book now, the Poseidon Project. It's such a fascinating and for me it's completely out of my arena of knowledge, and I found it so interesting, and I hope that we get to discuss a lot of the issues that you talk about: mining, wrecks, pirates, research, fishing. I mean, it's just so describe to us what the book is about, and also why you felt the need to write it.
Yeah, and I think it kind of follows on in some ways from my earlier work, as an international lawyer interested in international cooperation and organizations. I'd done earlier books on the history of the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And so in that sense, I was interested in international governance of the oceans, and I wanted to write an accessible, interesting history of it because I think there is so much about it that's interesting. But one of my frustrations was that a lot of the literature about it gets very technical very fast, because you basically have kind of lawyers arguing about, fine points in international treaties. And I wanted to try to present an accessible history of this process of figuring out how to govern the oceans. And it was more challenging, I would say, than the other book projects because the subject is so vast. And, I'm dealing with a bunch of different international organizations and different issues, as you mentioned, seabed mining and piracy and naval competition, and trying to weave it all together was a real challenge. So I hope I've managed to do it in a way that's digestible.
Yeah, and it's it's so interesting, and a lot of it. When I was reading it, I was thinking, oh my god, of course. Oh yeah, why haven't I thought about that? I mean, it is something. The oceans are something that we should all be aware of, especially with regards to the environmental angle, which of course has become increasingly important in recent years.
Yes, and there's an image. I think we often kind of forget that the oceans, of course, are 70% of the Earth's surface, and there's a wonderful image taken from space where if you catch the Earth at the right angle, essentially all you see is ocean. It's in the Pacific, and it makes you, astronauts have talked about this and how it makes them realize that this is a blue planet and the oceans is really the dominant feature, and yet obviously human activity is largely on land, and so that's what we focus on. But figuring out how to govern this 70% of the Earth's surface is an enormous task.
And why, can you explain a bit about why this is becoming a problem now? Because if for centuries we lived by this phrase, the freedom of the seas, and it seemed to work quite well. I guess partly because our capabilities were such that we just couldn't access. We could travel with in ships, but we didn't have the capabilities that we have now of mining and kind of staking claim to the high seas, the oceans. So what's been happening recently that has changed, or that is changing?
Right. So there are several different dimensions of it, and part of it is, I mean, as you say, technological change has greatly increased the human ability to use and exploit the oceans. And so when the idea of freedom of the seas was introduced, and that most famously by Hugo Grotius in the early 1600s, to him it seemed that the resources of the ocean were totally inexhaustible. You could just, there's no way in which one country fishing somewhere could really detract from the ability of someone else to use the ocean's resources. And so some of his arguments rested on that idea of the inexhaustibility of the ocean's resources. But now we've got, super trawlers and, enormously efficient fishing fleets that go far afield, that have refrigerated, storage capacity, that can stay at sea for months. And so we've realized, of course, that the resources of the sea are not inexhaustible, and people who track fish stocks have grown increasingly alarmed over recent decades about the state of many fish stocks around the world. This has become really evident recently, kind of off the coast of South America, where you've seen largely Chinese fishing fleets showing up and just conducting pulling in enormous hauls as the coastal states kind of watch. But then it's not just fish, of course. It's as you mentioned, the technological ability to mine the deep seabed, which is something that has been talked about for decades, but is now really now becoming a commercial possibility. And that's got a number of scientists and environmentalists very alarmed, because we're only now understanding some of these ecosystems in the depths. And to kind of go down there and mine could have enormous implications for some of those ecosystems. So that's a big part of what's going on, is the human ability to exploit the oceans has grown so exponentially. And then from a kind of national perspective, I mean, governments and sovereigns have always liked the idea of being able to control areas of the ocean, because it could be useful to them strategically, economically. But the capacity of navies and coast guards to actually do that has again jumped with remote sensing, with underwater drones, and so on many different levels, the human ability to control and exploit the oceans has really exploded, and that makes some of these governance questions very acute in ways that they weren't before.
Mm. And one thing that I found particularly interesting, and I'd sort of felt bad that I'd never really thought about it. So can you explain how much of the sea off the coast of any particular country does that country own or control? Because it is right, isn't it, that the area around, say Britain, for a few miles out to sea, that is Britain, still counts as that country. Is that correct? Can you explain that?
And this was a big issue running through the book, and it was something very hard to negotiate for a long time. And actually, Britain played a very key role in trying to keep this limit. For a long time, the rule was 3 miles. That you could go 3 miles from the coast would be considered national waters, where only that country and its inhabitants would have the right to fish, and essentially it was national territory. The origins of that are kind of interesting. It was often referred to as the cannon shot rule, because the notion was, well, you can control as far out to sea as a cannon can shoot. The idea being, if you can kind of exclude others from land, but by means of shore-based cannon, then that's rightfully yours. And at that time, I mean, in the 1600s, 1700s, 3 miles was kind of used as a rule of thumb. But that started to change in the 20th century when a lot of countries started making much bigger claims, saying, why should we be limited to 3 miles? We want to own the waters out to 100 or maybe even 200 miles. And so what we've ended up with, after a big complex negotiation that went on for much of the 1980s, was a 12-mile territorial sea. Okay, so we've quadrupled the traditional size of the territorial sea. But the other big change is that coastal countries got to control the economic resources out to 200 miles. So that means they don't own those waters in the sense that, the within 12 miles they do, but they control fishing, they control mining, they control any economic activities essentially in those waters. That's called the exclusive economic zone. So I guess that's probably the most accurate way to say it, is kind of out to 200 miles, the coastal state has significant control.
Okay, and landlocked countries, just bad luck.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an issue throughout the negotiations. Landlocked countries trying to figure out how they can have their rights. They have the right to flag vessels, so a landlocked country can have vessels out there, and they have some rights to kind of access the ocean, although that's a little bit murky. But they don't get a territorial sea, and they don't get an exclusive economic zone of their own. No.
No. Um, so I think now I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests, which is, if you could go back to a year in history, David, which year would it be?
Right. And the book goes back in some ways even to ancient times, but I think the year would be 1982, because, well, for a couple different reasons I can talk about, but I think that would be the year I would select, which I hope qualifies as a history still.
Well, I don't know. I was thinking about it. For me, who's normally, in the ancient world, or at least the medieval world, I was thinking, is this politics or is it history? But it's within my lifetime, which is a huge thrill. I actually remember 1982 vaguely, and it's. Yeah, definitely. For my kids, it would be ancient history. But it is our most recent year on our timeline. So it's the most recent year that we've ever visited on Travels Through Time. So you've got that accolade. So can you tell us a bit about 1982 and the sort of general what was going on the seas in 1982? Set the scene for us a bit.
Yeah, so 1982, we are, in political terms, we're very much in the Cold War. In fact, the Cold War has become kind of colder, and tensions between the US and the Soviet Union are fairly intense, with the election of Ronald Reagan, who's been elected on a very hawkish platform toward the Soviet Union. Fears about, I mean, I remember this as a kid, fears about nuclear war, were very much kind of part of the landscape. And so it was in geopolitical terms, it was a very kind of fraught period, I would say. Judging from the photos of, family photos, it was a very fraught period in fashion terms as well.
A great period in the history of music, though. There was some fantastic music around then. That helped, I think. Okay, so let's go to your first scene, which takes us right to the top of the globe, but it does involve some of these political issues. So where are we going?
Right. So we're going to the very northern reaches of the Canadian Arctic. And a place called Ellesmere Island, and there's a small group of explorers kind of huddled there, and they're kind of wintering there. And this was Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who is a kind of classic British explorer type. He'd been in the British Army. I think he'd gotten himself kicked out of the Special Air Service for some kind of stunt, but had gone on to be, kind of the leader of various expeditions. And he'd had the idea of trying to, essentially within a year, reach both the South Pole and the North Pole. And so he's done the South Pole already, and the expedition has kind of moved by boat up to the Arctic. And he and the team have just finished completing the Northwest Passage, which is a kind of fabled sea route that has been a kind of focus of interest, because it's a way of kind of cutting transit times if you can find a way through the Arctic by sea. And so he's actually managed to get through the Northwest Passage, and is then kind of sheltering on Ellesmere Island in Canada, and then waiting for a few months, and he's going to make the trek across the Arctic ice to the North Pole. But I think it was quite important to him and his team that he make make that trip through the Northwest Passage, because of all of the historical interest and all of the explorers in the past, some of whom had died attempting to complete the Northwest Passage. But he and his team were able to do it in a relatively small open boat.
And was it, because on the map, and I hope that we're going to be able to put a copy of that map on our website so people can have a look at it. But there's loads of islands, aren't there, north of Canada, and the Northwest Passage, was that one particular route, or was it just if whatever route you could find through it?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's through the kind of Canadian archipelago up there, and so it's a little bit misleading to say the passage, because you're quite right that there are different passages, and there are different routes that you can take to kind of make it from the Pacific over to the other side, or vice versa. And he and his team had selected the kind of particular route that they thought they were able to make, given the state of the ice, etc.
Yeah, because it's very weather dependent, I would imagine, that kind of journey. And hadn't they been looking? I mean, wasn't the Northwest Passage something that they started trying to find in Elizabethan times?
Yeah, it had been a focus even that far back. And then in the 1850s was when it was kind of first completed successfully. Although I think that initial one they completed part by boat and then part by sledge. So the ice obviously, makes things incredibly difficult. But it is this object of fascination. Can we figure out this kind of shortcut of a route? And so it's something that has really drawn people, over the centuries.
But it never became a route, did it? And I mean, it isn't a route today, or is it?
Well, that's the interesting thing and I think such an interesting thing about this moment is that he and his team were going right on the cusp of the Northwest Passage becoming more viable as a route. And so if you look, and there are a couple services that keep track of all of the successful passages or the successful trips through the Northwest Passage. And you see that the number of successful passages increases as we move into the later 80s, 90s, and then into the 2000s, to the point where we're getting kind of regular commercial, not a lot, I don't want to overstate it, but you are getting some regular commercial traffic through the Northwest Passage. And you're also getting some, sightseeing kind of cruise ship voyages. Yeah. And this is because the ice coverage is changing, of course, as a result of climate change. So he and his team are there really right on the cusp of the Northwest Passage becoming even more of a object of fascination and in a sense, commercial realization, or the beginnings of commercial realization of the Northwest Passage.
And then can you talk a bit about the relationship between Canada and the US and the Northwest Passage? Because that became quite a bone of contention, didn't it?
And it in some ways, they've agreed to disagree now, but it remains a bone of contention that could become more acute. And just a few years after this expedition, the US sent a Coast Guard icebreaker through the Northwest Passage. And it became extremely controversial between Canada and the US because the US did not request Canadian permission. And that is because there is a difference of view between the United States and Canada about the status of the Northwest Passage, with the United States arguing that the Northwest Passage is an international strait. And that is a special status under international law, meaning, a narrow passage that connects two areas of the open ocean. And that is supposed to be open for everybody to use.
Can you give us some examples of other ones?
Yeah, sure. So the Strait of Gibraltar would be a classic case, connecting the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and the Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, connecting the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. And these are several of those are, of course, major thoroughfares for traffic. The Northwest Passage is not yet, but the US is quite insistent that this be seen as an international strait, whereas from Canada's standpoint, at least parts of the Northwest Passage go through Canadian waters. And therefore, Canada's view is essentially it's under Canadian control, and Canada's permission needs to be sought. And so that really came to a head in the mid 1980s between the US and Canada after the passage of this US icebreaker. And Canada kind of took the next steps to really formalize its claim to the Northwest Passage. Now, as I say, the U.S. and Canada have basically agreed to disagree at this point, but it's an issue that's not going to go away, I don't think, and particularly if the Northwest Passage becomes more commercially viable, I would expect that this would come to a head at some point.
And didn't they do something quite sort of typically Canadian and charming to the boat? Didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. While the U.S. Coast Guard vessel was passing through, I think some Canadian activists had rented a plane, and they dropped on the deck of the icebreaker a canister full of Canadian flags to express their. It seemed a little aggressive from a Canadian standpoint, but to symbolize the Canadian control of the Northwest Passage. One thing that was interesting in the book is that Canada, which you think of, well, at least I, covering multilateral issues, I often think of Canada as kind of a good multilateral citizen,
Yeah.
very interested in global processes, etc. But they take on a different dimension when you look at Canada's maritime behavior. And Canada can become quite assertive about certain, of its maritime claims, including on the fishing front. And there were a couple incidents where Canadian patrols went and chased off foreign fishing vessels, even beyond that 200 miles we spoke about. So really kind of not clearly in compliance with international law, but they've chased off foreign fishing vessels. And so Canada's a little different when you look at it through a maritime lens.
Yeah, I was surprised when I read that as well, that it didn't seem characteristic. Um, let's go to your second scene now, and we are going to have to get on a very large, comfortable boat in order to get there. We've got a long journey. Where are we going?
So we are now going to another remote area, to the South Atlantic. And we are going to a spot in the South Atlantic about 500 miles northeast of the Falkland Islands. So right, kind of remote South Atlantic, 500 miles from the Falkland Islands is the spot.
And what's happening there? I think I can guess because that is one of my abiding memories of that period of my childhood, was my dad listening to the radio and telling me to be quiet because he wanted to hear what was happening in the Falklands conflict.
Yes, and so this is in if we were up in the Canadian Arctic in January, this would be in June, and June 8th, 1982 in particular. And there is a tanker, a civilian tanker called the Hercules, which is transiting through that area of the South Atlantic, having departed from the Virgin Islands and on its way up to Alaska. I think what was going on is there's a refinery in the Virgin Islands, and then oil is picked up in Alaska. And I think it was on the way back from the refinery to pick up more oil in Alaska. And this vessel is suddenly bombed by an aircraft. And this was, of course, a consequence of the Falkland Islands conflict, which was playing out at that point between the UK and Argentina. It was unclear initially whose aircraft had bombed the Hercules. In subsequent weeks and months, it became fairly clear that it was an Argentine aircraft that had struck the Hercules, thinking, I believe, that the Hercules was going to be bringing oil potentially or fuel to British forces in and around the Falkland Islands. The Hercules was lucky. It had a mostly Italian crew, I believe, and it didn't sink immediately. It was able to limp toward the South American coast, and but ultimately was scuttled because the damage was seen as too much, and there was a bomb that they couldn't dislodge from the hull, and so the Hercules was lost. And I think what's kind of important about this is it highlighted, and really the Falklands conflict, which was one of the first major naval engagements since World War II, highlighted this issue of what happens during naval combat to civilian vessels and what happens to maritime commerce generally. And it was kind of a reminder that actually it's very likely, if there's any sustained naval combat, it is going to have enormous ramifications for maritime commerce, which is so important, of course, and so much of the world's goods are transited by sea. During World War I and World War II, there were massive and unprecedented restrictions on maritime commerce through a couple of different means. The British tried to strangle Germany by closing off access to the North Sea, essentially. There were mines used. And then, of course, there was unrestricted submarine warfare. And I think the world kind of forgot about that in some ways after the World Wars. But the Falklands conflict was a reminder that the rules that had existed had basically broken down during the World Wars. And there, countries who were fighting were going to put massive restrictions on maritime commerce. And I think the Falklands conflict and the plight of the Hercules in particular was a reminder of that reality.
But not one that's been dealt with, has it? I mean,
not really. I mean, there are rules of naval combat. And there are rules about how civilian vessels get treated. But what you saw Britain do and Argentina do during the Falklands conflict was essentially declare enormous areas of the ocean to be off limits. Say 200 miles exclusion zone. And that was a reflection of tactics that were used during the World Wars and are very much kind of fly in the face of international law that had existed prior to the World Wars. So that problem has not been really dealt with. And it's something that for people looking at the current, maritime friction is very troubling, because if you think of the South China Sea or something like that, where there's a real possibility of naval combat, if the precedent of the Falklands and then the World Wars before that are any guide, you would have massive restrictions and an enormous disruption to civilian maritime traffic.
Yeah, and supply chains. I mean, we saw that with the Ever Given.
Yes.
Last year. It doesn't take...
I mean, that was a great reminder for people about how dependent we are on maritime flows. And then more generally, we've seen kind of supply chain issues and ports getting backed up. But something like conflict in the South China Sea would really be enormous in terms of the disruptions for maritime commerce.
Hi there, it's Peter here. UnseenHistories.com is now 3 months old, and already it is packed full of enticing, illuminating, and excellently presented historical material. If you give the site a visit today, you'll see many beautifully illustrated excerpts of books that we've featured on Travels Through Time. There's excerpts from Malcolm Gaskell's Ruin of All Witches, Nigel Pickford's Samuel Pepys and the Strange Wrecking of the Gloucester, and Gary Shaw's Egyptian Mythology, along with many others as well. For those of you who like maps, you might want to check out the utterly compelling series of pieces on the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. That was a crucial moment in the American Civil War. Along with a range of fabulously colorized images from Jordan Lloyd, it really is history for our times. unseenhistories.com.
So I think now, if it's okay, we'll go on to your next scene, because that is very much about how people were trying to deal with these issues at the time, isn't it? So where are we going next? We're getting back on our ship and
now we're going to warmer climes,
somewhere much nicer.
yeah. And all the way to Jamaica, and this would be at the very end of the year, so December 10th of 1982, and we're going to the Rose Hall Beach Hotel in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And what is happening there is that diplomats and dignitaries from around the world are arriving and streaming into the hotel for the signing ceremony of an enormously complicated document, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it was, the negotiation process started in the early 1970s. The negotiations dragged on all the way through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. And what they were doing, in essence, was trying to put some stability back into maritime affairs, because I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, you'd had this process of wildly different national claims to the oceans that really, after World War II, with countries starting to claim big areas of the oceans and big territorial seas. And it came to be understood that we needed some kind of system. We needed some kind of rules that everybody could agree on about what the national zones in the ocean are. And we also needed answers to this question about the mining of the deep seabed, which we referenced a bit earlier, but was becoming a major focus. And so all of these issues got mingled together, and diplomats tried to hash out a grand compromise about that. And that was reflected in this United Nations Convention. And on that day in Montego Bay, 117 countries signed the agreement, which I think was the most countries that had ever signed an international treaty on a given day. And that reflected the broad consensus that, okay, this is a complicated compromise, but it's something that we need. And that we need a new rule book for the oceans. And so that was the moment that kind of marked the culmination of this more than decades-long negotiation process.
And the UN had initiated this whole thing effectively. Is that right?
Yeah, it had been initiated, both by the UN itself and by member countries working through the UN, but it had been done, yes, under the auspices of the UN. That's right.
And who didn't sign it? Because I think that's quite important.
Yeah, that is important. Because, as I said, there was very broad international support, but there was one country that was not there signing that day, and that was the United States, which was the leading and remains, in many respects, the leading maritime power. And so here you've got a big convention on the rules for the law of the sea, and the largest maritime power is not signing it. And that goes back to a little bit, we described the overall political climate and the rise of Ronald Reagan in the United States. And the Reagan administration, when it came to power, decided this is not something we can live with, and chose not to sign it, in large part because they didn't like the idea of there being international control over seabed mining. The rest of the convention, the 12-mile territorial sea that we talked about, the exclusive economic zone, all of that the United States was okay with. But it didn't like this idea that there would be an international agency that would be giving licenses to mine the deep seabed. The US wanted more like the Grosjean framework of everybody go out and do what you want. And, the resources of the sea are open to everybody.
The Wild West, as it's been described. But why do you think that was? Because it doesn't seem to make much sense to think that it would be a better idea to just let everyone have a free-for-all. I mean, surely that would just result in conflict almost immediately.
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, you had several U.S. companies. There weren't many companies that really were going to be able to mine the seabed. And so, and some of the leading contenders would have been U.S. companies. And so from the U.S. standpoint, it wouldn't have been a bad world for everybody to be able to go down and mine where they could, because only a few countries would be able to do this, and they'd be able to reap the economic rewards of it.
So it was greed, basically.
Yeah, it was greed, but it was also a kind of the other element I would say is there was a deep reluctance in the Reagan administration and in general among conservatives in the United States to empower international bureaucracies. I think that's kind of the other element here. They didn't want to empower international bureaucracies, and they certainly didn't want international bureaucracies getting a cut of something that private companies had spent money to, invest in the technology to do. And then you've got to give some of the proceeds of that to the international community, whatever that means. That was quite offensive to both some of the private sector actors, but also more generally to U.S. conservatives. And that strain of thinking is still very much there, of course.
Yeah. Well, and here, the whole idea of ceding power to an international or European organization, if we could use that word.
There are kind of what I would see as more and less defensible perspectives on that. I mean, there are important questions actually about accountability of some of these international bureaucracies. And actually that's playing out right now on the seabed, because you've got this International Seabed Authority, which is putting together regulations about mining of the seabed. And interestingly, some of the voices that are most critical of the International Seabed Authority are now coming not necessarily from the political right, but from the kind of political left on environmental grounds, saying that this international bureaucracy is not responsive enough to environmental concerns. And so it's kind of an interesting evolution that's happened on that issue.
Yeah. And so this International Seabed Authority, that's been set up since?
Yeah, it's been set up and it exists in Jamaica in recognition of Jamaica's role as the place where the convention was signed. You have the International Seabed Authority there. It's not very well known, but it's an international agency that in a sense has control over and the right to license the use of a vast area of the deep seabed.
And who's it made up of? I mean, who works there?
So there's actually a British, it's headed by a British guy, Michael Lodge, and then there's a
no surprise there.
Yeah, and there's a kind of multinational staff.
Right.
Not huge, several dozen people who work on these issues. But as seabed mining starts to become more commercially possible, there's some new attention being paid to this otherwise obscure international body and questions about whether it's really capable of doing what it's supposed to do and effectively regulating this new industry.
And is it affiliated with the UN or not?
Yes, it's affiliated with the UN because it was created by this UN convention. So yes.
Goodness me. So
it's a remarkable thing, and it's one more way in which these maritime issues are becoming more and more salient. From the kind of strategic standpoint, you've got tension in the South China Sea, tension in the Mediterranean, this question of these Arctic passages and who has the right to use them. And so there are multiple different ways. And in a sense, this big compromise that was struck and signed at Montego Bay is, I think, facing some real pressures now.
And did the USA ever sign it?
No, the U.S. has not signed it. The U.S. Has, again, the U.S. view is that most of the provisions in the UN Convention are international law, and the U.S. says that it abides by them. And in fact, if you look at what the U.S. says about, for example, the South China Sea, the U.S. says we're defending these rules against China, which is trying to claim more of the ocean than they should. But the U.S. has not signed on to it in large part because of the seabed mining issue.
Right.
Which has been actually a frustration for the U.S. military. The U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, they all want to sign on to it. But it's been impossible to get the requisite number of senators on board, because you've got to get the treaty through the U.S. Senate. Two-thirds of the U.S. Senate you need.
And would it change their powers? Is that why the Coast Guard wants them to sign it?
They want it because they see from when it comes to what the U.S. Navy does and what the U.S. Coast Guard does out on the oceans, they see the United States as being in favor of the international rules. And therefore, they want to be fully part of this convention. It wouldn't change their powers in terms of what they can do, but they can more credibly say, hey, we're defending the international rules, and China is not.
Has China signed the?
China actually has, but has signed and ratified, and yet many of its activities in the South China Sea are pretty much in tension with the rules. So you've got a kind of odd situation where you have the country that claims to be defending the international rules has not signed on to the convention, and one of the countries that is in many ways putting these rules under strain has joined the convention.
Extraordinary. Well, just to finish off, can you talk about the Homer Simpson episode? Because I think that was a really nice, and actually that maybe encapsulates some Americans' view of the whole high seas issue.
Yeah, and I was clued into this by a friend of mine, so I can't claim to have. My Simpsons knowledge is not as encyclopedic as this guy's knowledge. But when he heard that I was writing about this, he said, "Oh, you got to watch this episode." And so Homer is, if I remember correctly, Homer is trying to buy alcohol on a Sunday, and his town, I guess, doesn't permit the purchase of alcohol on a Sunday. And so somehow, or somebody tells him, well, if you go out onto the open ocean, you can buy alcohol and drink on Sunday. And so he charters a boat and crosses out beyond the 12-mile mark, I guess, onto the open ocean, and there beholds this armada of vessels engaging in all sorts of crazy, wild, otherwise illegal activity. And I think it may end with them getting captured by pirates or something like that. But he says, as he crosses the line, he says, welcome to international waters, the land that law forgot. And yeah, I mean, I think that does capture something important about the public perception of the oceans as a kind of lawless space. And on a more serious note, there is lots of lawlessness on the open ocean. And there's been some really fascinating journalism recently by, there was a former New York Times correspondent, Ian Urbina, and then there have been a couple of other accounts of the lawlessness and that happens on the oceans, a lot of it in terms of human rights abuses on vessels and that kind of thing. I argue that lawlessness is not really the right way to think about the ocean and how it's governed and what's changing. But yes, there is lots of lawlessness that happens on the ocean for sure.
But there's that whole issue of jurisdiction, isn't there? If a crime is committed, then which jurisdiction is it in?
And what really aggravates that issue is the phenomenon of flags of convenience, which I try to talk about some in the book, which is essentially commercial vessels might be flagged by or fly the flag of a country that they have no real connection to. Lots of Panamanian and Liberian flagged vessels. And that means in legal terms, Panama and Liberia have the clearest legal jurisdiction over those vessels, but they might have zero interest in really investigating or regulating what's going on that vessel. And that's one of the reasons why you get these pockets of effective lawlessness on the oceans, because the country that has the clearest legal jurisdiction doesn't have any interest in really pursuing what's going on those vessels.
And what would it take to change that? I mean, that shouldn't be allowed. It sounds crazy.
It seems like madness. And what would be required is some kind of international agreement to enforce a real linkage between the vessel and the flag. That, okay, it's got to be owned by a company, or it's got to be, staffed by, crewed by people from that country, that there's got to be some, what they call a genuine link between the vessel and the country that has legal jurisdiction. But they've never been able to agree on that, in part because the shipping interests are powerful, and the shipping interests generally see this as in their interest,
an advantage.
To avoid, excessive regulation.
Yeah. Oh, it's really just a whole world, a whole watery world. Fascinating. So could you please tell us, David, now, if you could have picked something up or taken something with you and brought it back from 1982, what would it be?
Yeah, and I was thinking maybe about, I think one of the bombs that was dropped on the Hercules was a dud, and so I was thinking maybe, if it really weren't dangerous, I could grab that. But I think that would get nixed. So I think it would have to be the signed copy of the final treaty from Montego Bay, which all of these diplomats who'd worked on this issue over, many of them had worked on it for more than a decade, including some, really interesting characters. I think it would be really cool to see that signed, have that signed document, with all of these signatures affixed to this very long and complicated document. I guess physically it exists probably at the UN headquarters in New York. So I suppose I could go there and try to see it. But I think that's what I would take.
I think that's a great choice. And this has been such an unusual and interesting and surprising episode. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to read your book, which I really, really enjoyed. And I think, it's something that we should all be thinking about a lot more than we do. So thank you.
No, thank you. It was really, really fun to talk with you about it.
That was me, Violet Moller, speaking to David Bosco the other day about his new book, The Poseidon Project, The Struggle to Govern the World's Oceans. It's available now from all good bookshops. For images and maps illustrating our conversation today, please go to tttpodcast.com. There you can also find our whole archive of other episodes. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.